Welcome to Face Towards Zion. Thanks for watching and thank you for your comments. Starting next year, we will be studying the Book of Mormon. I originally began this channel for the Book of Mormon curricula. The Book of Mormon chapters are still relevant, and so please watch those videos next year. Today we begin with the Book of Hebrews. The Book of Hebrews seems to have been written to the Hebrew church. The Hebrew people were proud of their heritage. They looked to cling to that heritage. The writer of the Book of Hebrews looks to their customs and points out that their heritage is fulfilled in Christ. He uses the Old Testament to point this out. One thing he will point to is the temple, which historically was the tabernacle, or even called the tent. Pictured is a drawing by Caspar Lukin titled The Purification of the Red Heifer. There is a lot going on in this picture. I will come back to this later, but for now, notice that the sacrifice they are completing occurred at a distance from the tabernacle. Note the gate on the fence surrounding the tabernacle. There is only one gate. Remember that they would situate the temple with the Holy of Holies in the westernmost part of the fence. The sacrifices would then occur east of the Holy of Holies. Pictured is the sacrifice of the red heifer. This sacrifice occurred east of the tabernacle, outside of the perimeter of the fence. Also noted that over the tabernacle rests the Shekinah, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. We will come back to this drawing. This week's lesson is on the epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Hebrews. It seems like the first question always asked of this epistle is, did Paul really write it? Look at the epistles of Paul and see how they are organized in our present Bibles. If you look at the dates they were written, you notice that they jump around a bunch. The epistles were in fact organized in our current Bibles, with the longest epistle, that to the Romans, first, and the shortest one, Philemon, last. But then they put the book of Hebrews, which is one of the longer epistles, last, even behind Philemon. The reason this is last is because the authorship of Hebrews is questioned. We could spend a couple of hours showing how this book is different from the other epistles of Paul, or we could even spend a couple of hours showing how it is the same, but we would never come to a conclusion. One answer is that Joseph Smith, when he translated the Bible, did not change this title. At times, Joseph even referenced Paul as a writer of the book of Hebrews. See, for example, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith, page 59. But I don't think you can conclude a lot from this. I don't know if Joseph knew through inspiration that Paul was indeed the writer of the book, or whether this was even on his radar. So even though there are reasons for and against, I think the quickest conclusion would be that we really don't know. And you know what? It really doesn't matter. The book is an incredible book and we can learn a lot from it, regardless of who wrote it. Perhaps a better question is, who is the audience of the book? And honestly, we don't completely know the answer to that question. However, there are a number of things about the book that we do know. One, the book is a homily on the Old Testament, particularly the Psalms. Now, one thing scholars like to do is use big words that no one knows the meaning of, so the scholar looks really smart. The problem is, as soon as you learn the definitions of the big words, you learn they're not as smart as they would like to think they are. The word homily is defined as a religious discourse that is intended primarily for spiritual edification rather than doctrinal instruction, or it is a synonym for a sermon. So basically, this means the author is going to use a lot of Old Testament scriptures in this talk. Now, he would only do this if his intended audience was familiar with these verses. He would only do this if his audience had a Jewish background, meaning they are of Hebrew descent. The book of Hebrews will quote over 70 Old Testament passages. Not all of these passages are referenced in footnotes in our LDS edition of the scriptures. You will want to get a list of all these verses and link them in your electronic scriptures. There is value in seeing the verses that he is quoting. Interestingly, most of the scriptures quoted are from the Septuagint version. Remember what the Septuagint version is. In the 3rd century BC, Alexander the Great conquered the known world at the time. Greek became the common language of the world. In order that the world could start to know the Hebrew religion, in approximately 250 BC, a group of 70 elders, some say 72, as they claim it was 6 from each of the 12 tribes, translated the Torah from the Hebrew into the Greek. That version of the Bible is what most people used at the time of Christ. However, I find it interesting that for the book of Hebrews, the author used the Greek translation instead of the Hebrew translation. This is an argument of Paul not being the author of the book. This also means that if you look up the corresponding verses in today's King James Version, you will note that they will not always be word for word the same. Don't let this limit you in your understanding of the book. Second, the audience of the book was heavily dependent upon the law of Moses. One of the purposes of this book is to show that Christ fulfilled the Mosaic law and brought a new covenant. In fact, the sacrificial offerings of the law of Moses all pointed to Christ, and that our salvation centers in Christ and not the sacrificial offerings of the law of Moses. Since there is so much Old Testament and law of Moses in the book of Hebrews, sometimes it's difficult for us today to understand it. To get the most out of the book, we have to apply the concepts that the author discusses into our lives today. If we struggle in understanding the Old Testament, we will struggle to apply the book of Hebrews today. The conclusion for us today, and perhaps the meaning of the book, is that while the covenant we make are vital to return to God, it is in fact the person we become that ratifies these covenants and allows us into God's presence. As we go through the book, we need to keep in mind the means versus the ends. I have stressed this point in other videos. In the scriptures, if a story is given, don't focus on the story. Instead, focus on how to apply that story into your life today. The scriptures are not just a storybook. Instead, the scriptures are here to teach us how to return to our Father in heaven, and we have to apply this to our lives today. But how do we do this? How do we catch this vision? It can be difficult. We must study and ponder. A very good article on the book of Hebrews is an article titled Hebrews, to Ascend the Holy Mount by M. Catherine Thomas. This article originally appeared in the book Temples of the Ancient World, edited by Donald W. Perry, and was republished in the book Selected Writings of M. Catherine Thomas. Fortunately, the book The Temples of the Ancient World can be found online. Go to scholarsarchive.byu.edu and you can find the article. I highly recommend this article. In this article, M. Catherine Thomas focuses on the promises of the book/gospel and then the price that we have to pay in order to obtain those promises. Now, remember when you completed English 101, or depending upon your age, English 1010, you learned that when you write a paper, you're supposed to tell the thesis of your paper in the opening paragraph, and then the body of the paper is to provide arguments that supports this thesis. You then conclude with a restatement of your thesis. I have heard that the thesis of the book of Hebrews is contained in the first 3 verses, Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. However, this just doesn't feel right to me. It seems to me the book has much more to say than this. To me, the thesis of the book seems to be in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 13 and 14. Note that this is at the end of the book. It seems to me that the author makes his arguments and then sums them up in his thesis statement at the end. These verses say, "Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. For here have we no continuing city, but we seek one to come." What do you think of that as a thesis statement? I shared those verses with a few friends to get their reactions, and everyone responded with something like, "Yeah, I didn't understand a word of that. Maybe you should explain what that is saying." So let's take a few minutes on this verse. Then as we go back through the book, we'll be looking for arguments to support this thesis. Then hopefully the book will make a little more sense. These verses begin with, "Let us go forth therefore." Perhaps the key word here is the word therefore, Greek toinun. In the Greek, this is the first word in the sentence. Many modern versions will use this word first for this verse. See, for example, the New King James Version, the Darby Bible, the Revised Standard Version, or the English Standard Version. Whenever you use the word therefore, basically you say you are now going to draw a conclusion. You have given numerous examples of your thesis, and now you are going to state it. Because of all I have said so far, therefore, or I am now going to state my thesis. So you can see why I say this is the thesis statement. Because of all the previous arguments the author has made, we will now conclude that he needs to do something. What do we need to do? We need to go forth. The meaning is we will now set a goal to do something. We will go forth. But what are we supposed to go forth to do? Let us go forth, therefore, unto him without the camp. What does this without the camp even mean? At this point, good commentaries will link this verse to a verse such as Leviticus 4:21 or even Leviticus 16:27. Leviticus 4:21, and he shall carry forth the bullock without the camp, and burn him as he burned the first bullock. It is a sin offering for the congregation. Or Leviticus 16:27. And the bullock for the sin offering, and the goat for the sin offering, whose blood was brought in to make atonement in the holy place, shall one carry forth without the camp. And they shall burn in the fire their skins and their flesh and their dung. An interesting word search is to use your Gospel Library app and do an exact phrase match in the scriptures for the phrase, quote, without the camp, unquote. If you do this and search the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Pearl of Great Price, you will get a total of 0 hits. In the New Testament, the only place this phrase is found is in Hebrews chapter 13, particularly in verses 11 and 13. But if you do this search for the Old Testament, you will find a lot of hits. Remember, I said that if you want to understand the book of Hebrews, you have to understand the Old Testament. To any Hebrew living at the time this epistle was written, they would have understood this phrase. Today, probably not so much. Earlier I quoted Leviticus 4:21. Note that the phrase without the camp is also in verse 12 of that chapter as well. It is all over in the Old Testament. But what is this phrase doing in the book of Hebrews? The book of Hebrews will tie the old law with the new law. Let's take just a minute to understand what this meant in the old law. As I understand it, there were 2 sacrifices that were performed, quote, without the camp, unquote. One was during Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement. The other was the sacrifice of the red heifer, which is what was pictured initially. The verses I quoted earlier all reference the sacrifice during the Day of Atonement. Not a lot is known about this sacrifice. Studies on the Day of Atonement usually center on the actions of the high priest and the role of the scapegoat or Azazel. All Alfred Edersheim says in his book on the temple about the sacrifice carried out without the camp is, quote, while the scapegoat was being led into the wilderness, the high priest proceeded to cut up the bullock and the goat with whose blood he had previously made atonement, put the inwards in a vessel which he committed to an attendant, and sent the carcass to be burnt, quote, outside the city, unquote, in the place where the temple ashes were usually deposited, unquote. And that is it. Pretty quick. But why was the author of the book of Hebrews concerned about such a minor detail? Let's review what was said in chapter 13, verses 9 through 13. Be not carried about with divers and strange doctrines, for it is a good thing that the heart be established with grace, not with meats, which have not profited them that have been occupied therein. We have an altar thereof, whereof they may have no right to eat which serve the tabernacle. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. Here he references an altar. What altar is he referencing? Of course, he was saying that each of us has an altar that we offer our sacrifice. These include our daily sacrifices, etc. But in this instance, he is also referencing an actual altar. If not, why then would he bring this up? Anciently, the temple had 3 altars. Generally, we only discuss 2. The altar of burnt offerings and the altar of incense. The altar of burnt offerings was a huge altar that was in the court of the priests. The priests would keep the coals hot and would sacrifice the bullocks and the lambs and the goats and the turtle doves, etc. for the burnt offerings, the sin offerings, the trespass offerings, etc. Usually when you discuss the different types of sacrifice, they were offered on this altar. The other altar is the altar of incense. This altar was in the holy place and rested in front of the veil of the temple. It was this altar that would burn incense, representing the prayers of the people. Remember the story of Elizabeth and Zacharias, how he was chosen to go into the temple and offer a sacrifice? It was on this altar that he would have gone to. However, there is a third temple altar named the Mifkad altar. There is much less known and understood about this altar. I searched on the internet for a picture of this altar, but couldn't find any because I don't know if they know what it looks like. Let's return to our previous slide discussing Hebrews 13. Verse 10, we have an altar, whereof they have no right to eat which served the tabernacle. For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. Notice the words without the camp in verses 11 and 13 and without the gate in verse 12. Here I return to the painting that was on the initial slide. Without the gate. Anciently for the tabernacle there was a fence around the tabernacle. It only had one gate. That gate was on the east side. If you were to enter into the sacred space of the tabernacle, you had to enter in from the east side. You would be moving from east to west, which is in a westerly direction. Remember Adam and Eve, when they were kicked out of the garden, were kicked out where? East of Eden. So for them to return to the garden, they had to move from an east location and move westerly. The picture shown shows the tabernacle. The one gate is on the east side, and then at a distance a ways away, or outside the camp, was another altar. How far outside the camp was this other altar? Again, it's the Old Testament that tells us. Joshua chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. And they commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests, the Levites, bearing it, then ye shall remove from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Come not near unto it, that ye may know the way by which you must go, for ye have not passed this way heretofore. So the Old Testament specifies that 2,000 cubits is the distance that separates the profane space from the sacred space. Of course, the question is always, right, what's a cubit? Sorry, you have to be pretty old to get that joke. A cubit was the length of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger of the king. The problem was when they got a new king, and then this distance changed a little, depending on whether the king was tall or short. Generally today, a cubit is considered to be about 18 inches or about 1.5 feet. So 2,000 cubits is about 3,000 feet. Remember that a mile is 5,280 feet. So 3,000 feet is a little over half a mile. Now, if you want to be precise, it's 0.568 of a mile. So anciently, to be outside or without the camp, you had to be a little over half a mile from the Holy of Holies. Putting this all together, we understand that the Mikvah altar was located a little over half a mile east of the temple. That puts it on the Mount of Olives. To get to it, the priest would have to walk through the Kidron Valley. This area was considered to be unclean, so to compensate, they built a 2-story bridge called the Bridge of the Red Heifer. They would leave the temple and go on this bridge to the Mikvah altar, where they would offer these 2 sacrifices. Now, the book of Hebrews indicates that Jesus also suffered without the gate. Most commentaries, when they discuss being without the camp, will indicate that Christ was crucified outside the walls of the city. Remember, we often sing a song in sacrament meeting that goes, there is a green hill far away, without a city wall, where their dear Lord was crucified, who died to save us all. This celebrates he died without a city wall or outside of the wall. Note that this is not saying that the hill or even the city does not have a city wall, but that Christ was without the city wall. It also notes that the hill was green. When I was in Jerusalem, I didn't see any green hills. Perhaps the Garden of Gethsemane was green before it was taken over by the cemetery, but I get carried away. And there are two traditional places where Christ was crucified, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb. Interestingly, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is located west of the temple, and the Garden Tomb is north. Both are closer than 3,000 feet. If you take the book of Hebrews literally, Christ was crucified without the camp and without the gate. Perhaps neither the Church of the Holy Sepulchre nor the Garden Tomb is the real location. I've gone on a tangent. Let's get back to our thesis statement. Let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. We've discussed the first part of the sentence. The remainder says, let us go forth therefore, bearing his reproach. Here, without the camp is simply a prepositional phrase which clarifies the word him, so we know who the author is referencing. What does it mean, bearing his reproach? Anciently, the Christians struggled when talking with Greeks about their God. The gods of the Greeks were all powerful and would always vanquish their enemies. Imagine how would you respond if they were to say something like, well, your God isn't much of a God if he would die on a cross. How great is a God like that? How would you explain that he was killed by other men? So his reproach references his death on the cross, which occurred without the camp. So if you take the book of Hebrews at its worst, Christ suffered without the gate. The Garden of Gethsemane is just east of the temple, with the gate being east of the tabernacle. Then this reference refers to his atonement in the garden. But Christ's reproach or crucifixion was outside the camp. The Mifkad altar was east of the temple and was located without the camp. This would indicate that Christ was crucified somewhere in this same location. What it is saying is that this book is a treatise on Christ's reproach or his atonement. Look to see the atonement and you will begin to understand what the book is talking about. The theme of the book is that through the atonement, Christ became a God and will be able to save us, his children. If we look at the book this way, then it starts to make sense. But wait, there is another verse. For here have we no continuing city, but we seek one to come. What continuing city is he talking about? Like I indicated, the author of the book of Hebrews has previously made his arguments of his thesis statement. His arguments included a holy city. The first reference in the book of Hebrews is in chapter 11, which is the chapter on faith. Here he is referring to Abraham. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Still referencing Abraham, the author continues, but now they desire a better country, that is, an heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. Looking at verse 9, the Greek word translated as sojourn means to dwell beside or to live as a stranger or foreigner. So Abraham, even though he was living in the promised land, only had the citizenship of a foreigner. This wasn't his homeland. He didn't have rights of inheritance. The word translated as strange means foreign, and the word translated as tabernacles means tents. In the scriptures, tent dwelling sometimes symbolizes the conditions of God people who are like wanderers waiting the time when a permanent city of Zion will be established, which itself anticipates a heavenly home in the celestial kingdom. The usage of tent dwelling can also be used in the Book of Mormon when it refers to Lehi as dwelling in a tent. So chapter 11 sets the city as a temporary city that foreshadows Zion, which is a type of our heavenly home. The verse in chapter 12 builds on this concept and is even more direct. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. Here the author uses a number of synonyms to reference the city of the living God. These are Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem, an innumerable company of angels, and the general assembly, and the church of the firstborn. Now, I have seen each of these phrases represent things that are just a little bit different. They are very similar, and thus they meet the definition of a synonym, yet they each have a little different meaning. Earlier, I referenced the article by M. Catherine Thomas. In that article, she refers to the promise of the Lord. Note also that when you read the book of Hebrews, it's a good idea to highlight the word promise. By highlighting it, you will notice how many times that word is mentioned. She refers you to Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, verses 68 and 69, which says, "Therefore, sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. Remember the great and last promise which I have made unto you. Cast away your idle thoughts, and your excessive laughter far from you." So, what is this great and last promise? Sister Thomas then references various terms in the book of Hebrews referencing this promise. She lists obtaining a good report, chapter 11, verse 39, entering into the Lord's rest, chapter 4, verses 3 and 10, going on to perfection, 6 and 1, entering into the holiest, 10 and 19, being made a high priest forever, 7 and 17, knowing the Lord, 8 and 11, pleasing God, obtaining a witness of being righteous, and having the law written in the heart. However, I do not think this list is exhaustive. When you read through the book, there are many other mentions of this promise. The most concise verses are those in chapter 12 listed on the previous slide. These verses include Mount Zion, the general assembly, and the church of the firstborn. The book of Hebrews seems to allude that these refer or mirror the heavenly Jerusalem and hint that we will receive these blessings in the next life. However, do these verses also reference an earthly city? Our gospel teaches us very clearly that this can be an earthly city. Our 10th article of faith states, "We believe in the literal gathering of Israel and in the restoration of the 10 tribes, that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisical glory." This says that the gathering of Israel will be a literal event. This is not meant for the next life. This will happen in this sphere, that Zion will be built upon the American continent. Here I like the use of the word Zion. One day Zion will be a literal city, and it will be built here in America. Also, what blessings would have been lost for the city of Enoch if they had concluded that this city was only a heavenly city? They believed and had faith in establishing such a city, and they did it. Today we will never be able to build Zion until we first believe that we can do it. I believe that the city or Zion is what the author of the book of Hebrews was referring to when he said, "For here we have a continuing city, but we have no continuing city, but we seek one to come." The author of the book of Hebrews knew that this city would not be realized in his day, but he knew that one day one would be built here on earth. It is for this city that we seek. We seek one to come. And how do you seek this city? Or how do you seek Zion? Answering this question is the thesis of the book of Hebrews. We seek for Zion. Now, may I add a word or two when it comes to translating languages? You can't just do a word-for-word translation. Take a sentence from one language and put it in Google Translate and see what comes out. Generally, the sentences won't even make sense. Yet it was a word-for-word translation. Instead, you have to translate ideas and thoughts. So, how do you seek Zion? First off, you have to understand what that means, and you have to believe it can be done. Then you have to look towards it. Now, translating the figurative into the literal, to seek something, you have to search for it. You have to be focused on it. How can you be focused on something if you are not looking at it? So you have to look at it. If you are looking at something, is your face not turned towards what you are seeking? So if you seek for Zion, do you not have to have your face towards Zion? Isn't this verse basically saying you have to have your face towards Zion? I guess you can see why I like this verse. If the city referenced here is Zion, which it is, and we seek one to come, then the meaning of this verse is literally the purpose that I had when creating this channel. We must have our face towards Zion. Let's read the book of Hebrews through with this lens. If we look for this, you will be amazed what you will see. Now that we have spent almost all of our time on 2 verses, let's look at the book as a whole. The best overview of the book of Hebrews I have found is at the Precept Austin website. His overview is shown here. Basically, the first 7 chapters address the question of what have we. Chapters 8 and 9 address this institution of Christianity and that we have such a priest. And then chapters 10 through 13 address the fact that having what we just outlined, therefore let us do the following. The Come Follow Me lesson for this week covers the first 6 chapters. Chapters 1 and 2 discuss the Torah and the law that the Hebrews are living under. The idea is that this Torah was given by angels. Angels are God's representatives. These chapters basically say that Christ is superior to the angels, and so his message is above the Torah. Chapters 3 and 4 discuss the role of Moses and Jesus. In the Hebrew belief system, Moses is the ultimate lawgiver. Moses is the original builder of the tabernacle, which led to the temple, which is the focus of the Hebrew people. These chapters show that while Moses did not lead the children of Israel into God's presence, but that Christ can. Chapters 5 through 7 focus on the priests and Melchizedek. The idea being that while the priests are after the order of Aaron, the Melchizedek priesthood was before Levi, and so his order was established before the Aaronic priesthood and is therefore greater. Old Testament prophecies point to Christ as being from the order of Melchizedek. In our remaining time, I'd like to show in chapter 1 how the author of the book leaned on the Old Testament to show that Christ was the fulfillment of Old Testament and prophecy. After the introductory 3 verses, there are 11 verses in the King James Version. In these 11 verses, the author will quote 7 Old Testament verses. However, verses 8 and 9 are a continuation of a quote, as are verses 10, 11, and 12. Verse 4 doesn't have a quote. Verse 5 has 2 quotes, and every other verse until verse 14 are quoting Old Testament scriptures. Sometimes our King James Version hides what is happening in the verses. Suppose the chapter were formatted like verses 4 through 7 is shown. This is a better illustration of what is happening in this chapter. Starting in verse 5, for unto which of the angels said he at any time, quote, Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee, unquote. Here he's quoting Psalms chapter 2, verse 7. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. That's in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. And again, when he bringeth in the first begotten into the world, he saith, quote, And let all the angels of God worship him, unquote. That is Psalms 97 and 7. And of the angels he saith, Who maketh his angels spirits, and his ministers a flame of fire? Psalms 104 and 4. Sometimes when you compare these verses to the Old Testament, remember that generally the author is quoting the Septuagint and not the King James Version, which was written some 1800 years after the Septuagint. Remember that earlier I said that Hebrews was a homily on the Old Testament. You can see how the author uses Old Testament verses to make the point that the Old Testament was pointing to Christ. To tie in our theme of the continuing city, a passage of particular interest is in chapter 3. Let's read verses 7 through 11. Wherefore, as the Holy Ghost saith, and now he will quote in Psalms 95, Today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation, in the day of temptation in the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me, proved me, and saw my works 40 years. Wherefore I was grieved with that generation, and said, They do always err in their heart, and they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. That's Psalms 95, 7 through 11. While the Book of Mormon seems to focus more on Isaiah than it does the Psalms are present. I have heard that perhaps the most quoted psalm in the Book of Mormon is Psalm 95 and 11. Here the psalmist talks about entering into the rest of the Lord. Interesting, this phrase, enter into my rest, is not found anywhere else in the Old Testament. In the Book of Mormon, Jacob will refer to it once, the Savior will refer to it once in 3rd Nephi, and Mormon will refer to it once. But it is most common in the Book of Alma. In Alma chapter 12, Ezra seems to be sincerely pondering on the gospel. Alma teaches about the plan of redemption, and he says, verse 33, but God did call upon men in the name of his Son, this being the plan of redemption which was laid, saying, if you will repent and harden not your hearts, then will I have mercy upon you through mine only begotten Son. Therefore, whosoever repenteth and hardeneth not his heart, he shall have claim on mercy through mine only begotten Son unto remission of his sins, and these shall enter into my rest. Alma will then use this phrase, enter into his rest, 3 more times in chapter 12, and then 5 more times in chapter 13. Alma will use this phrase as he transitions to chapter 13, where he will discuss foreordination and the Melchizedek priesthood. The author of Hebrews basically does the same thing. He uses this phrase 1 more time in chapter 3, and then he uses that phrase 7 more times in chapter 4 before transitioning to the Melchizedek priesthood in chapters 5 through 7. So, what is the tie between entering into rest and the Melchizedek priesthood? Why does both Alma and Hebrew tie these concepts together? The answer is found in Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, beginning in verse 19. And this greater priesthood, here this greater priesthood is talking about Melchizedek priesthood, administereth the gospel. This is basically saying that the Aaronic priesthood administers the church, while the Melchizedek priesthood administers the gospel. Okay? And holdeth the keys of the mysteries of the kingdom, even the key of the knowledge of God. Therefore, in the ordinances, or the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood thereof, the power of godliness is manifest. And without the ordinances thereof, and the authority of the priesthood, or the Melchizedek priesthood, the power of godliness is not manifest unto men in the flesh. For without this, no man can see the face of God, even the Father, and live. Now this Moses plainly taught to the children of Israel in the wilderness, and sought diligently to sanctify his people, that they might behold the face of God. Now it is this experience of Moses is what is being taught in Hebrews. Verse 24, but they hardened their hearts, and could not endure his presence. Therefore the Lord in his wrath, and for his anger was kindled against them, swore that they should not enter into his rest while in the wilderness, which rest is the fullness of his glory. So here it clarifies the phrase, enter into his rest, is really saying, enter into his fullness of glory, or as verses 21 and 22 phrase it, the power of godliness is being able to see the face of God. So it is entering into his presence, and you can only do this with the ordinances of the Melchizedek priesthood. So that is how the two are tied. The Melchizedek priesthood administers the ordinances that allow you to see the face of God. This is the process that is taught in the temple, and I may add, this process is taught in the Book of Mormon as well. And this whole process is how the Book of Hebrews ties this into the concept of having your face towards Zion, which is the purpose of the book. See how the author illustrates this concept? There is even more in next week's lesson.